Okay, now if you chose to skip the first video, here's the build-up to X-Men Legacy in a nutshell.
In the climax of a storyline called Avengers vs. X-Men, Cyclops, who was possessed by the Phoenix Force, killed Professor Charles Xavier. The two actually had a strained relationship at the time. Charles's death came just as he was re-establishing a relationship with his son David, the mutant known as Legion. Charles was working with David in an attempt to control the multiple personalities that dwelled within David's mind.
X-Men Legacy would explore the effect Xavier's death had on his son. And we're covering the first storyline today, which is called Prodigal.
In a prison known as the Cortex Complex, a being known as the Extractor begins taking out one of the prisoners for the purpose of conducting some type of experiment. Meanwhile, one of the other prisoners, a woman named Panov, begins planning her next big move. We then see someone wake up in a tent of a man named Mirza the Mystic. The unseen individual introduces himself as David Haller, son of Charles Xavier. David then begins going over the aspects of his life. In a nutshell, David's insane, though today he's actually feeling pretty good. Mirza and David have been living in an encampment based in the Indian Himalayas, where Mirza works on healing mentally strained psychic mutants. David tends to a mutant named Zorda, whose psychic abilities have resulted in him growing a brain tumor. It's then that Mirza and David notice a group of villagers coming towards the encampment. Back in the Cortex Complex, the Extractor begins work on Panov. The Extractor then begins talking about Charles Xavier. It turns out the Extractor is actually David, and the Cortex Complex is David's mind. However, the frustration David has with his father has provided Panov with enough to attempt an escape, thus taking over David's body. It's then that Mirza teleports into David's mind and takes down Panov. Mirza then turns David's attention back to the villagers. David and Mirza begin to work on the villagers. David cyclically projects himself as a godlike entity. The entity could either be generous or wrathful. The villagers begin to bow down before David and Mirza, and David just tells them to go home. However, it's then that David is struck by some type of psychic message. In New York, at the Jean Grey School for Higher Learning, a young psychic mutant named Blindfold also receives the message. In David's mind, the impact of the projection causes the prison to open. The other personalities begin to emerge, and David has witnessed the death of Charles Xavier. David awakens and discovers the encampment has been completely destroyed. Mirza is dying. Mirza's last words are for David to find the X-Men, as only they can help them now. Meanwhile, in David's mind, the personalities begin to riot in an attempt to gain control of David's body. Panov begins to make her move, only to immediately have her throat slit by what appears to be a new personality. The other personalities begin to swarm David, each one desperately trying to take over the mutant's body. Finally, one identity named Kerbox the Cracklar begins managing to lay a hand on David. This causes him to take off and fly to China in real life. David is then taken over by some type of cowboy persona, who then uses David's body to begin shooting up a Chinese military camp. Finally, David manages to wriggle away from the other personalities and find a hiding place. He comes to just as the Chinese army has tracked him down. As David prepares to run away, a voice begins calling out to him. It's then that David notices a pair of disembodied eyes floating in front of him. The eyes begin to form a body around them. As Legion demands to know who exactly it is he's talking to, the being flicks a large icicle and guides David to safety. Meanwhile, a group of X-Men arrive at the wreckage of the encampment where David was living. The team consists of Wolverine, Storm, Beast, Blindfold, Chamber, and Frenzy.
Okay, we need to introduce a few new mutants here. First off, there's Blindfold, but we're actually going to be touching a lot on her backstory later on. So let's move on to Chamber. Now, he is actually a being of pure energy trapped in a human shell. And when he projects his energy out, it basically blew his lower jaw and most of his torso completely to smithereens. He's also a descendant of longtime X-Men foe Apocalypse. Next, we have Frenzy. Now, she has almost impenetrable skin, and she's usually been depicted as a villain, serving under both Magneto and Apocalypse.
Blindfold scans through much of the wreckage and senses that the individual behind this is very scared. Chamber then looks up information on any similar events and finds out about Legion and the Chinese army. Back in David's mind, he's being tracked throughout his refuge by a persona named Tyrannax the Abominable. He's able to track David down through telepathy. David manages to briefly return to the real world, where the being who saved him says that he needs David for the future. The being then begins to take David to task over his recent actions. He's been acting too afraid. It's sudden they come across 2 Chinese soldiers. The being explains that he has the ability to plot future events as need be, and the icicle he flicked earlier causes a small avalanche which takes out the 2 soldiers. Another group of soldiers arrives and the being starts killing them. Back in David's mind, Tyrannax begins chasing David. Finally, David strikes back at the Abominable. He sticks the extractor glove into Tyrannax and absorbs the creature's telepathy. David then puts the soldiers into a euphoric state, allowing the 2 to escape. David then tries telepathically sensing the being and seeing a series of visions, including a pair of Japanese twins being held hostage. The being disappears, and David resolves to go to Japan. Inside David's mind, he begins using Tyrannax's telepathy to hunt down the other personas that are still searching for him. As this goes on, David arrives in Japan. He struggles at first, but eventually manages to telepathically locate the twins. He rushes to where he believes they are located, only to discover...
I was going to do the whole Q Akbar thing here, except Legion kind of already does that.
David is knocked unconscious by a large white raven that flies through his head. He then wakes up to find himself in a room with the twins and a group of masked individuals. The leader of the masked men introduces them as members of the Yamaguchi Kai Yakuza clan. The twins are the offspring of the clan's dead leader, the girl Tengu Karasu and the boy Tengu Shobujo. The twins are both psychic mutants who really just want to leave David alone, but the masked man orders them to torture David. David cracks a few jokes, but the Yakuza clan decides to demonstrate their power. They drag in somebody from outside, and the leader has the twins remove the man's soul. Meanwhile, an unseen individual calls the X-Men to inform them of Legion's whereabouts. Back with David, he's left alone with the twins. He asks the twins if they enjoy hurting people. Meanwhile, in his mind, David stalks a persona called the Origamist, who can warp reality. His attempt to extract the power does not work. The twins continue talking with David, and they say they don't really want to hurt people, but family tradition dictates so. David tries another personality, a flame wielder named Max Kelvin. It also fails. David then tries relating to the twins by telling them about his father. The twins begin scanning David and look into his past. Meanwhile, David goes after another persona called the Chronodon. It too does not work. He then goes after an acid spitter known as Pukotas. And he fails again. With the twins, David tells them that they can live up to their father's expectations even by taking different actions than their father. The twins allow David to get a hold of Max Kelvin. He then burns out of his bonds, and he makes a deal with the kids. The twins begin using their abilities to locate the alternate personas in Legion's mind and bring them to the extractor. The 3 begin making quick work of the Yakuza. However, it's then that the X-Men arrive. The X-Men say they only want to help Legion, but David notes that Chamber has been sneaking around in preparation for an attack. Both Storm and Beast say they want to help the twins, but David points out that the twins will only be trained for combat, and the choice to be peaceful should be up to them. Wolverine steps up, telling Legion to stand down, so David bluffs and threatens to slowly torture the limits of Logan's healing factor. This puts Logan off enough for David to hit him with a psychic attack. David then begins walking away with the twins. The twins resume catching David's alternate personas so that he can utilize their abilities. However, Storm comes after the trio. David taps into a persona named Kazek the Conduit. This enables him to reflect Storm's lightning attack back at her. Frenzy is the next to attack, so David taps into non-Newtonian Annie, who has the ability to absorb any direct physical attack. Chamber then steps up and manages to temporarily incapacitate Legion. The twins still help David by bringing him the Skinsmith. This allows David to put a layer of skin over Chamber's mouth. It's then that Blindfold appears. She enters Legion's mind and informs him that the 2 are destined to become nemesis. She then smooches him, which allows her to psychically bond him as well. This limits David's ability to tap into his powers. David begs to be let go, as this has frightened the children. Except, it's all interrupted by a new persona slicing Blindfold's throat. Blindfold disappears from Legion's mind with him still tied up and all his personalities free. In the real world, David takes the kids into the Yakuza's ammo stock room in order to buy some time. Outside, the other X-Men find a barely breathing Blindfold. Chamber then steps up and prepares to slice open the flap of skin covering his mouth and fire at the ammo shack. Inside, the twins are afraid as they sense the coming attack. This is enough for David to free himself long enough to tap in to the Origamist. The shack explodes, but David uses the Origamist's reality warping powers to literally fold the fire away. David disappears, but the twins are left behind. The X-Men take the twins on board the Blackbird. As the plane leaves, David returns and notices a pair of eyes staring back at him. Inside the Blackbird, Sojibo assures Kasuro that they are right where they need to be. David manages to follow the twins to New York, where he hauls up in an abandoned shack. He begins meditating in an attempt to rein in more personalities. In this case, Findle the Finder and Wormhole Vodo. He uses their abilities to open up a wormhole and summon an alien race in order to provide a diversionary attack on the Jean Grey school. He summoned the Dire Wraiths.
Dire Wraiths are a cousin species to the Skrulls that dwell in a section of space called the Dark Nebula. And yes, I am aware that the Dire Wraiths are the primary villain in the ROM Space Knight comic, and I'd love to get into the whole mess that is ROM, but we just don't have the time right now.
David then taps back into Tyrannax's telepathic powers to locate Blindfold. He enters her mind and begins to learn the young mutant's backstory. Ruth Aldine was born without eyes. Her deformity also led to her mutant ability, and it caused her father to walk out soon after. Ruth grew up under constant abuse, both physical and mental, by her brother, Luca. Eventually, Luca fell in with a group of criminals, and jail time ensued. Luca then found religion, a bigoted mutant-hated religion, and when he was released, the abuse intensified. One day, Luca made a move to try to kill Ruth. However, her mother stepped in the way, and Luca killed her instead. Ruth was sent to live with an aunt, while Luca got the death penalty. On the day Luca was to be executed, Ruth chose to attend. Except something happened. Luca's soul somehow exited his body and attacked Ruth.
Yeah, I have no idea whether or not Luca is actually a mutant. In fact, I'm pretty sure the comic doesn't even know.
During the attack, Luca's soul ripped out a part of Ruth's powers and disappeared. David recognizes something about Luca's soul. He calls out to Ruth in an attempt to wake her from her coma, but something starts pulling him out of her mind. The last thing David sees is Sojibo entering Ruth's room and attacking the attending physician. He returns to his body to find Kasaru holding a knife to his throat. Kasaru gives David a message from Sojibo. It tells him that something is coming that will wipe out the mutant race, and his sister is really the only one who can stop it. The note is signed, Luca.
Yeah, if you haven't figured it out already, Luca is the being that Legion met in China, and he's also the guy who tipped off the X-Men about Legion's whereabouts in Japan. And now he's in possession of Sojibo's body.
David begins trying to explain to Kasaru that Sojibo is dead and his body is being controlled by someone else, but she doesn't believe him. Finally, David's had enough. He calls on the Origamist once more and folds himself away. He appears in Blindfold's hospital room and stops Luca from stabbing her. Luca just smiles and prepares to fight back. All of this winds up being detected by the X-Men member Pixie.
Pixie is a mutant fairy hybrid who has the ability to manifest rainbow wings, emit a hallucinogenic dust, and she's also a very notable magic practitioner.
The amount of psychic injury that Legion and Luca put out causes Pixie to teleport into the hospital room. Legion and Luca exit the room realizing that they've been detected. They enter a study room where Luca prepares a circumstance to trap David. It doesn't really work, and so Luca is forced to drop a bookcase on him. David bursts out and chases Luca to Charles Xavier's grave. Luca begins taunting David, saying that his father is in hell. This is interrupted by a falling Dire Wraith. Luca was trying to make it land on David. David prepares for a final strike on Luca when Kasaru steps in. Kasaru's interference causes David to briefly lose control of his alternate identities. This allows the new persona to take over. Legion smacks Kasaru aside and tells Luca that he is going to be useful someday. The new persona then returns control of David's body to him, causing the Dire Wraiths to vanish and bringing the X-Men. Luca pretends to be Sojibo and blames Legion for hurting Kasaru. However, Blindfold appears and stabs Luca in the back. Sojibo's body begins to decay, but Luca's soul disappears. Later, after Blindfold explains everything that happened, the X-Men allow David to leave of his own accord, but with the option to come back if he needs them. As he leaves, Kasaru yells at David for what happened to Sojibo. David then meets Blindfold at the school gate. David asks Ruth what made her come out of the coma. She responds that he called for her. Blindfold then warns David not to go too far in the dark as he walks away. Not too long after that, David gets hit with a psychic message from the new persona. The person says that Luca saw was Legion destroying the mutant race, and Blindfold being called upon to try to stop him. The person then reveals himself to be Charles Xavier.
And that ends the first volume of X-Men Legacy-Prodigal. How was it? Well, on the plus side, I did find Legion's initial story about trying to follow in his father's footsteps to be pretty interesting. Also, the comic is pretty well paced for the most part. 6 issues doesn't feel like you're reading 6 issues. And Luca is an interesting, albeit confusing character. I mean, still don't know whether or not he's a mutant. On the downside, though, the artwork is pretty hit or miss. Sometimes it looks like they're trying to go for a photorealistic look, and then other times it looks really, really cartoony. And I don't just mean it in David's mind, I mean the real world looks really cartoony sometimes. Also, the story feels a lot like it's mostly set up, particularly the fact that we keep jumping in from David's mind into the real world, and then back into David's mind, and then back into the real world. That gets really jarring. Sometimes I just wish they maybe had an issue that was just all in David's mind. I think that would have been a lot better. And to be honest, there are times where David/Legion just really isn't that interesting. I mean, it's interesting when he's kind of trying to go after the personalities and rein them in, but other than that, it's kind of blah. And that's why I'm going to give X-Men Legacy-Prodigal a D. And with that, let's see what we'll be doing next time on the Random Trade Review.